Xieshu was a man of extraordinary talent and noble bearing, a young prodigy admired by all. His only flaw, it seemed, was having a wife of humble birth. Xieshu did not like me. He despised my supposed lack of refinement, my ignorance of literature and ink, and above all, resented what he saw as my shameless clinging to his family's power and prestige. We had been married for 4 years, and for 3 of those years, he had voluntarily requested a posting far away from the capital. On the day he returned to the capital, he brought back bolts of exquisite shoe brocade for every female member of the household, every single one except me. That night, as I helped him undress, I told him I wanted a divorce. Xieshu's face turned cold. Is this all because of a bolt of brocade? My voice was soft. It's not just about the brocade. The outer robe in my hands still held the faint warmth of his body. I tightened my grip instinctively and repeated myself, more firmly this time. It's not just about the brocade. The candle flame crackled sharply. Xieshu's calm, scrutinizing gaze fell on my face. He was as handsome and composed as ever, but the youthful vigor that had made him the talk of Chang'an Street when he was named the third-place scholar in the imperial examinations had long been worn away by 3 years of exile in the provinces. Now he was even more inscrutable, even more distant, so distant that I could never hope to reach him. The only thing that had never changed was his unwavering estrangement toward me. Our marriage was never of our own choosing, it was arranged by our fathers, Xieshu said, his voice cold as he stated the facts bluntly. For years ago, it was you who came to the mansion with the marriage contract, begging me to marry you. An invisible wave of embarrassment washed over me, making it hard to breathe. Anxiously, I rubbed the fabric of the robe between my fingers, the intricate patterns of floating clouds and wild cranes prickling my fingertips. I had stayed up countless nights, stitching those patterns one thread at a time with my own hands. Perhaps my face had turned too pale, for Xieshu let out a faint sigh. There were only 3 bolts of that shoe brocade left at Yunqiu Pavilion, and I was in a hurry to return to the capital. It was not a deliberate slight against you. Tomorrow I'll tell Mo Yun to go to the storeroom and pick out a bolt of the finest Su embroidery for you. Fine clothes and silks are merely worldly possessions, don't let such trivial things upset you again. I heard the rebuke hidden in his words and looked up at him, stunned. During the 3 years Xieshu had been away, I had managed the entire household's finances and supplies. No one knew better than I how many bolts of top-quality Su embroidery were stored in the mansion's warehouses. If I had truly cared about fine garments, I would never have waited for him to offer me one. A jumble of sour, tangled emotions clogged my throat. I opened my mouth several times, but no sound came out. Xieshu's patience with me had long since run out. He cut off the conversation abruptly. It's getting late. Let's rest. The heavy bed curtains were drawn, cloaking the bedchamber in an even more intimate silence, the rise and fall of his breath. The solid warmth of his body beside mine, all of it served as a constant reminder that I was sharing a bed with another person. My husband, the same husband who had requested a posting outside the capital just 3 months after our wedding. The lamplight was dim, the silence so profound that every breath felt deafeningly loud. Suddenly, Xieshu propped himself up on one elbow, his body leaning over mine. The unfamiliar yet familiar scent of his incense invaded my senses, bringing with it a sharp, piercing ache. I was suddenly reminded of the welcome home banquet held earlier that day, when the old lady had smiled and said, "You're already 24 years old, it's high time you gave me a legitimate grandson." A searing pain gripped my chest, my heart pounding so violently that it roared in my ears. Then, all at once, the room went dark. Xieshu had blown out the bedside lamp. The man pulled back, resuming the same rigid, distant posture as before. The pain ebbed away, leaving me with a sense of relief I had not felt in a long time. But then, a heavy, indistinct emotion settled in my heart. Was it disappointment, or gratitude? In the darkness, I laughed silently at myself. The year I married Xieshu, he had just come of age. He had caught the emperor's eye with his answer in the imperial court, which had earned him the praise of a jade tree among orchids, and was promptly named the third-place scholar in the examinations. His future had seemed bright and boundless, his spirit unshakable. He had thought he would marry his childhood sweetheart, but instead, I had arrived at the mansion of the Earl of Jinning, bearing a marriage contract. The contract had been personally written by Xieshu's grandfather, the late Earl of Jinning, sealed with his private seal, a token of gratitude for my father's life-saving kindness. Xieshu had remained silent for 3 days before finally lowering his head in acquiescence. The brilliant young scholar had married a girl from the countryside, so I had always known that Xieshu did not like me, and I had always felt deeply apologetic for it. I rose at the 5th watch, just as a spring rain began to fall. Qingzhu was helping me with my hair when Xieshu returned from practicing swordsmanship in the courtyard, his clothes damp with mist and the faint fragrance of pear blossoms clinging to him. I lowered my eyes respectfully. Rising to help him change out of his wet outer robe, "I've told the kitchen to prepare hot water for you," I said softly. "The spring air is still cold, you should take care not to catch a chill." "No need," Xieshu refused flatly. His gaze lingered on my shoulders for a moment, and his voice turned even colder. "I'm meeting with some friends today. I won't be coming back for dinner." I nodded, tying his belt and stepping back half a pace. I never met his eyes, nor did I say a single extra word. "It's almost time. I'll head to the flower hall first." I no longer cared whether he appreciated my concern or not. It was merely my duty as his wife. The spring wind was sharp and biting on my way to the flower hall, but it did nothing to dispel my weariness. I covered my mouth and yawned. "Ever since the young master came home, you haven't even had a chance to sleep in a little," Qingzhu grumbled quietly beside me. "You stayed up for nights on end finishing that painting. You haven't had a proper rest in ages." "Be quiet," I warned her. "Now that the young master is back, things are different from before. We must be even more careful with our words." I pulled my silk robe tighter around me, then froze suddenly, finally understanding why Xieshu's attitude had turned so cold earlier. This robe had been tailored for me last spring. It was neither new nor old. Xieshu must have thought I was wearing this old garment on purpose. To pout and sulk about his failure to bring me a bolt of shoe brocade yesterday. A familiar wave of bitterness stung my nose. I blinked back the tears, feeling a sharp pang of sadness at how well I knew him and how little he knew me. When I turned the corner and entered the flower hall, the stewards sitting inside all rose to their feet at once, bowing respectfully. "Madam," I suppressed my emotions and forced a smile. "Please, be seated." The fragrance of tea filled the air as the stewards began to report on the household's affairs in an orderly manner. This was the rhythm I knew best. Gradually, my flustered heart calmed down. The meeting was drawing to a close. We had gone through 3 rounds of tea when a servant suddenly announced from outside the hall, "Mo Yun requests an audience." Mo Yun was Xieshu's most trusted personal guard. He had followed Xieshu since the age of 7. And was the only one Xieshu had taken with him during his 3 years in the provinces. As soon as he entered the hall, everyone rushed to bow to him. Mo Yun carried a wooden tray in his hands, bowing to me with neither servility nor arrogance. Before the young master left the mansion, he ordered me to deliver this bolt of Su embroidery to you, madam. The warm, lively atmosphere in the flower hall turned icy cold in an instant. Everyone in the mansion now knew about the shoe brocade incident at last night's welcome home banquet, and everyone in the mansion had long known that I was not favored by Xieshu. Sending Mo Yun to deliver this Su embroidery was, on the surface, an apology, but deep down, it was nothing more than a reprimand. "Thank you for making this trip," I said, my voice steady. "Please convey my gratitude to my husband for his kindness." Qingzhu stepped forward to take the tray from Mo Yun. He bowed again and took his leave. Leaving the flower hall in a deathly silence, the stewards exchanged glances, their expressions filled with unspoken sympathy. Over the past 4 years, I had managed the household with fairness and treated them all with kindness. Now, they clearly wanted to offer me their condolences. The heavy weight in my chest lifted slightly. I gave them a reassuring smile. If there's nothing else, you may all return to your duties, the stewards sighed. Rising to their feet in 2s and 3s, all except Uncle Chen, who remained seated on my left. Uncle Chen had served the Earl of Jinning's mansion for decades, a man of great seniority and experience who handled all the household's external affairs. During my first year in the mansion, my position had been precarious. As a woman of humble birth, I had walked a fine line, treading carefully with every step. When Xieshu had left for Shu Prefecture, abandoning me to manage the household alone, I had struggled to make ends meet. It was Uncle Chen who had taken me under his wing and taught me everything I needed to know. I poured him a cup of tea, knowing he had something important to say to me in private. That painting of yours, the one with the children chasing dragonflies, Uncle Chen said, cutting straight to the point. It was auctioned off at Shishan Pavilion. In the end, a young scholar traded a rare, famous inkstone for it. I was stunned, then burst out laughing. Lowering my head to hide my smile, I always thought my painting was nothing more than a silly pastime to amuse myself in the inner chambers. Do not underestimate yourself, Uncle Chen said with a smile, and there's more good news. He paused for a moment, then continued, his voice softening. Your exiled younger brother, he may be able to return to the capital within the next 6 months. The scalding hot tea in my hand spilled onto the table before I could stop it. The boiling water scalded my fingers, making them curl in pain. Uncle Chen jumped up in alarm, calling for servants, but I was too stunned to move. I was the daughter of a poor, unsuccessful scholar. I had lost my mother when I was a child. My father had failed the imperial examinations time and time again, and our family had lived in poverty, but we had been content. When I was 14 years old, Xieshu's grandfather, the Earl of Jinning, had accidentally fallen into a river while traveling. My father had saved his life, and the two men had become instant friends. During one of their drinking bouts, the Earl had taken up a brush and ink, and in a fit of drunken jollity, had written out a marriage contract betrothing his beloved grandson to me. After sobering up, my father had never dared to hold the Earl to his word, but 2 years later, the Earl had passed away. My father, who had studied hard for years, had finally passed the provincial examinations only to be wrongfully implicated in a major corruption scandal that had shaken the entire court. 3 months later, my father had died in prison, wrongfully accused. My 14-year-old brother had been exiled to the remote northwest. My grandmother had been bedridden with illness, with no money to buy medicine. Desperate and with nowhere else to turn, I had taken that marriage contract and gone to the Earl of Jinning's mansion. Tears streamed down my face, dripping onto the tea table. I pressed a silk handkerchief to my mouth, choking back my sobs with all my strength. Thanks to the debt of gratitude between our two families, the Earl's mansion would have sheltered my grandmother and me, but that had not been enough. To use the mansion's power to protect my brother, and even to bring him back to the capital one day, I had finally forced Xieshu to marry me by holding that marriage contract over his head. While the young master was away these past 3 years, he and I have been corresponding regularly all about your brother's case, Uncle Chen explained. We didn't tell you earlier because we were afraid that if things didn't work out, we would have gotten your hopes up for nothing. I could not stop my sobbing. This was always Xieshu's way with me, a slap in the face, followed by a sugar-coated date. But this time, I swallowed that sweet date greedily, tears streaming down my face. Madam, your marriage to the young master got off to a very rocky start, Uncle Chen sighed. I know how much you've suffered these past few years. He paused, then continued gently. Now that the young master is back in the capital, His official career is on the rise. For a woman in this world, one can only rely on her husband and children. Your days ahead will only get smoother and smoother. I wiped away my tears, smiling through my red, swollen eyes at Uncle Chen. But I paid no heed to his comforting words. After the emotional rollercoaster of the day, I felt an unusual weariness wash over me as I handled the remaining household affairs. That evening, when I served the old lady her dinner, she noticed my pale face and frowned. "What's wrong with you today? Sit down, quickly." I thanked her and took a seat. The old lady had never concerned herself with the running of the household, barely a month after I had entered the mansion. Before I had even learned how to read the account books properly, she had handed over the entire management of the household's finances and supplies to me. During the 3 years Xieshu had been away, the old lady had lived a carefree life, spending her days drinking tea and watching operas, leaving everything to me. I had only visited her during mealtimes to pay my respects. "Now that Cheng Jun is back, you must take good care of your health," the old lady said, patting my hand. "Give me a fat, healthy great-grandson as soon as possible." I lowered my eyes. "Yes, grandmother. All the men his age already have several children," the old lady sighed, shaking her head. If only things had worked out differently back then. She cut herself off mid-sentence, but I knew exactly what she had been about to say. If only Xieshu had married Chu Lan instead of me, he would have had a house full of sons and daughters by now. I had no reply to that. Chu Lan was the youngest daughter of the Vice Minister of Revenue, a childhood sweetheart of Xieshu's from a family of equal standing. She was the one who should have occupied my place. 3 months after I married Xieshu, Chu Lan became engaged. It was right after that Xieshu requested to be posted away from the capital. The rest of the meal tasted like ash in my mouth. I returned to our main courtyard, and after bathing, Qingzhu asked me, "Shall you paint tonight, madam?" It was already the 10th watch of the night. The daily household chores kept me busy enough as it was, and today, feeling under the weather, I was even later than usual. "I'll paint," I smiled. "This is the only time of day I get to truly relax." My painting studio was located in the main hall, with a view of the large pear trees in the courtyard outside the window. As I ground the ink stick, I suddenly recalled asking Xieshu if I could use his private study when we first married. What had his answer been? I dipped my brush in ink and was about to start painting when a gust of wind blew through, sending pear blossoms fluttering down in a white shower. Snow-white petals landed on my paper. I stared at them for a few seconds, thinking, if it were anyone else, they would be content with a marriage like mine. A country girl married into an earl's mansion, with a husband as handsome and talented as a jade tree among orchids, his official career on a steady rise. The Xie family had always upheld a strict, upright family tradition. One could only take a concubine if they had no sons by the age of 30. But when I closed my eyes, a jumble of sour, aching emotions washed over me like a tide. Marriage, after all, was like drinking water, only you could tell if it was cold or warm. The beaded curtain tinkled, and I heard the sound of someone greeting a visitor outside. Qingzhu said, "The young master is back, madam." Xieshu smelled of wine. He went to the bathroom to wash up on his own. By the time he came out, I had already finished most of my painting. I was so absorbed in my work that I only noticed the shadow falling across my paper when I looked up in surprise. Xieshu was wearing a pale moon-white inner robe, the collar slightly unfastened, his long hair loose and still damp at the ends. He was standing there, studying my painting intently. I was startled and tried to get up. But Xieshu gently pressed his hand on my shoulder to stop me. The warmth of his palm seeped through my clothes. Both of us froze, almost imperceptibly. "Young master," I said, my voice soft, "when did you return home?" How long had he been standing behind me, watching? "When did you learn to paint?" Xieshu evaded my question, reaching out to take the painting and examining it for a long moment before commenting. The shading is just right, and it has a lingering charm. When we first married, your handwriting was barely legible, you couldn't even read the account books properly. Xieshu looked up at me, his usual cold voice softening considerably. To have such skill with a brush now, I can tell you must have worked very hard while I was away. It felt like a tiny needle pricking my heart, a sharp, fleeting pain. It was true that I had no talent for classical texts or poetry, but I had picked up a brush and started painting when I was just a child. From my father to the teacher at the county school, and even the late Earl of Jinning, everyone had praised me for the natural grace and spirit in my paintings. I had been able to paint all along. It was not a skill I had learned after marrying him. But, wasn't I already used to this by now? I smiled faintly, lowering my eyes and saying nothing more. Xieshu admired the painting for a while longer, praising it repeatedly, before something seemed to occur to him. Why don't you paint in the study? His voice trailed off, and I could see that he had suddenly remembered why I never set foot in his study. A wind stirred outside the window, sending pear blossoms swirling through the air. Xieshu sat down opposite me, relaxed and at ease, just like he had been on that spring night of our wedding year. It had been a spring night much like this one. I had timidly asked him if I could borrow his private study, but Xieshu's face had turned cold instantly. Born into a wealthy, aristocratic family, Xieshu had been raised with the strictest etiquette and manners ingrained in his bones. When he was angry, he never lost his composure. He only became colder, more distant, just like he had been for days after I asked to use his study. A country bumpkin whose handwriting was barely legible had no right to set foot in the private study of the third-place scholar of the imperial examinations. I was wrong that day. I looked up in surprise, only to see Xieshu sitting up straight, his eyes fixed on mine. I was young and arrogant then, impulsive and hot-headed. I took my frustrations out on you far too often. Will you forgive me, my lady? Xieshu poured a cup of tea for me, his voice warm and gentle. From now on, you may use the inner study whenever you like. Tomorrow I'll tell Mo Yun to buy you all the painting supplies you need. No need, I said, staring at the wisp of steam curling up from the teacup. I thought to myself, this must be the first time we've ever had such a calm, equal conversation since we got married. It was just a pity that it had come too late. I smiled at Xieshu. This studio faces the century-old pear tree in the courtyard. The spring scenery here is perfect, and painting in this view puts me in a much more pleasant mood. You are the young mistress of this mansion. Who would dare to make you unhappy? Xieshu asked again. Did you like the Sioux embroidery I sent you today? That bolt of Sioux embroidery was garishly colored. It had been sent to the storeroom as soon as Mo Yun delivered it, and I had not even looked at it since. I loved it, I said, taking a sip of tea, my voice soft. Thank you, young master. Call me Cheng Jun. Xieshu repeated what he had said yesterday. Fine clothes and silks are merely worldly possessions. Now that you've taken up painting to cultivate your mind, you must understand that. I felt a faint urge to laugh. I had never been angry with him over that, nor had I ever cared about the missing bolt of shoe brocade, but I lowered my eyes and murmured, yes, there was no need to explain. I was already used to this. Since you've painted a pear tree on a spring night, Xieshu asked, have you given this painting a name? I stared at the painting and said softly, a snowdrift. Xieshu mulled it over for a moment, then suddenly smiled. It's a perfect name. Let's rest, he said, standing up. If I may be so bold, I'd like to keep this painting of yours. Before bed, Qingzhu let down my hair, muttering under her breath, honestly, one of your paintings sells for 100 taels of silver at Shishan Pavilion. You're practically giving it away to the young master for free. I laughed silently. As I walked over to the bed, I suddenly paused. Most of the candles in the inner room had been put out, leaving the space dim and shadowy, the faint scent of incense curling through the air, creating a hazy, ambiguous atmosphere. I already knew what was going to happen. When Xieshu pulled me into his arms and kissed me, my whole body trembled uncontrollably. He seemed to notice my unease, and his kisses and caresses grew gentler. The incense was light, our breaths mingling, our lips tangled together, in the gaps between his kisses. My mind drifted, unable to stop thinking about our wedding night. The room had been a blaze of red, the air thick with the smell of wine, the weight of his body pressing down on me, and the cold, almost cruel indifference that had felt like it would cut me open. The only memory I had of our wedding night was pain. The Xie family had always upheld a strict, upright tradition, and Xieshu had been entirely focused on his imperial examinations before our marriage. He had kept his inner courtyard strictly chaste, and when it came to me, he had shown not an ounce of tenderness. There had been no nuptial cups shared between us, no ceremony of tying our hair together as a symbol of our union, not even a single word exchanged. The red candles had burned brightly, the bed curtains warm, but the air had been stiff and heavy. It had been rough, brute force, his gasps and mine nothing more than raw, wordless release. "What are you thinking about?" Xieshu brushed the hair off my neck, pulling me back to the present. He whispered softly against my ear, "Let's have a child." I did not answer. I only thought to myself that this was only the third time we had been intimate, including our wedding night. For the rest of the night, I drifted in and out of consciousness. I vaguely remembered hearing the patter of rain outside. When I woke up, the sudden downpour had just stopped, the spring wind cold and damp, cutting through the air. The bed was soft and warm. Xieshu lay on his side, his inner robe wide open, his hand resting on my waist, sound asleep, his chest rising and falling steadily with each breath. I stared at him for a long time, thinking to myself, so this doesn't have to be painful after all. I carefully moved his arm off me and swung my legs over the edge of the bed, but my knees buckled uncontrollably. The servants who attended to the main courtyard had clearly heard the commotion last night. There was a smile on every one of their faces. As Qingzhu helped me with my hair, she complained lightly, "Why didn't you sleep a little longer, madam? The stewards are already waiting for me in the flower hall," I said, adjusting my hairpin gently. "The pear trees in the mansion are in full bloom. The old lady wants to hold a flower viewing banquet. There will be plenty to keep me busy." I had managed the household finances for 4 years now, from the early days of struggling to make ends meet to now handling everything with ease. I had developed a seamless rapport with all the stewards. After the morning meeting, I made my way to the old lady's courtyard. After paying my respects, I served her breakfast and reported on the household affairs. The old lady looked a little impatient. "As long as you know what you're doing, you know I've never cared for these trivial matters. But you must make sure the flower viewing banquet is a success," the old lady said. "Don't make the same mistake you did the first year." I replied, "Yes, grandmother." "Speaking of which," the old lady said, looking out at the pear trees in the courtyard and sighing, "it's already been 4 years." I looked at her, and from her expression, I could tell that she had forgotten the promise she had made to me 4 years ago. By the time I finished my chores and returned to the main courtyard, it was already dark. The main hall was lit with candles, and Xieshu was sitting leisurely on the veranda. When he saw me approaching, he closed the book in his hands, and that was when I realized it was my sketchbook. "You've had a long day," he said. "My mother was spoiled rotten before she married, and after she did, my grandmother took care of everything for her." He poured a cup of tea for me. "She knows nothing about running a household. I appreciate how much trouble you've gone to for her." "It's only my duty," I said, shaking my head. I sat down, my eyes falling on the sketchbook in his lap. "You love painting pear trees," Xieshu said. "Your paintings are full of life and spirit, but your subject matter is far too limited." I lowered my eyes, thinking to myself, "That's because the Earl's mansion is the only world I've ever known. You also painted a lot of rural scenes in the beginning." Xieshu paused, then asked anyway, "Why did you stop?" "Because the more I painted them, The more I missed home, and missing something you can never have only brings heartache. I had no answer to that. A moment of silence settled between us. Xieshu set the sketchbook down, his voice warm. Some friends of mine are coming to visit tomorrow. I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you again. This time, I had an answer. I smiled and said, "It's no trouble at all." Xieshu's friends were the Jinsha scholars who had passed the imperial examinations in the same year as him, including the eldest son of the Vice Minister of Rites. He was also Chu Lan's elder brother. The guests were received in the central courtyard, beneath the century-old pear tree. The two men drank wine, practiced swordsmanship, and debated current affairs. Looking perfectly content and at ease, I greeted them politely when I first arrived. Then excused myself to leave them to their conversation. Uncle Chen brought over some pear wine, saying it was the same wine that Master Chu always requested whenever he visited. I was on my way to the account room, which happened to pass through the central courtyard, so I offered to deliver the wine myself. As I rounded the corner of the corridor in the central courtyard, I suddenly heard Master Chu say, "You've really been wronged by this marriage." I froze in my tracks as Xieshu spoke up. Grandfather sealed the marriage contract with the family head's private seal. A promise is a promise. Master Chu clicked his tongue. Now that you're back in the capital, your official career is soaring. But with a wife of such humble birth, your in-laws can offer you no political support whatsoever, Xieshu said. A true man stands tall in this world by his own merits, not his family's. Of course, Master Chu laughed. I could never be as magnanimous as you. I took a deep breath. The jar of wine in my hand felt as heavy as 1,000 catties. I was about to slip away silently when Master Chu suddenly sighed. Lana has married into a duke's mansion, he said. Her life is comfortable and prosperous, but she often complains to me that her husband is nothing but a brute of a warrior. He knows nothing of romance, not even the first thing about poetry or literature. Master Chu sounded melancholy. If only things had turned out differently back then. His voice trailed off. Leaving the sentence unfinished, Xieshu fell silent. All I could hear was the rustle of pear blossoms falling in the wind. Xieshu's silence filled me with a burning shame. A bitter taste welled up in my throat, sharp and acrid, a mixture of guilt and heartache. "And what about you, top 3 scholar?" Master Chu laughed, his tone laced with sarcasm. "What does your country-born wife talk to you about?" The wind stirred, sending a shower of pear blossoms fluttering down around them. Xieshu's voice was carried away on the breeze, almost lost to the rustling petals. Though she comes from humble beginnings, she is full of natural wit and spirit. It's just that her character has a few flaws. Like any woman, she has a touch of vanity, but with proper guidance, she could be polished into a gem. I had no memory of who eventually delivered that jar of pear wine. All I could recall was the roaring in my ears, the daze that clouded my mind, the sharp, stinging ache in my throat and nose that threatened to overwhelm me. I returned to the main courtyard and, as usual, lit a candle to go over the account books. The fragrance of tea filled the air. The scent of incense wafted gently. Everything felt exactly the same as it always had. But when Qingzhu came to trim the wick of the candle, she suddenly froze, her voice trembling with alarm. "Madam, why are you crying?" I woke from my stupor as if from a dream, reaching up to touch my face. My fingers came away wet with cold tears. Outside the window, the pear trees blazed white. It should have been a peaceful spring night, quiet and uneventful, just like all the nights I had spent alone while Xieshu was away in Shu Prefecture. I had endured this for 4 long years, but I could not bear it any longer. This Earl's mansion had clamped down on my throat like a vice, slowly eating away at me until I could barely breathe. "Qingzhu," I said softly, "go fetch the small box I gave you for safekeeping." 2 hours later, Xieshu returned to the main courtyard, carrying the faint scent of wine on his clothes. When he saw me sitting upright in the main hall, he looked slightly surprised. "Why aren't you asleep yet, husband?" I said. pushing the document in front of me toward him. I looked into his handsome face and said clearly, "Let's get a divorce." The divorce papers had been signed and sealed by the old lady 4 years ago. She had had the authority to do so. My own name, written in my own hand, had been added only half an hour ago, pressed firmly with a bright red thumbprint, Shen Li. Ever since I had married into the Earl's mansion, no one had called me by my given name. Xieshu sat down across the table from me. The relaxed, domestic ease he had shown these past few days vanished completely. In its place was the man I knew far better. Distant, sharp-edged, his authority on full display, his voice cold and steady as he asked, "When did you write these divorce papers?" "4 years ago," I said, sitting up straight and meeting his gaze directly for the first time. "The day I married into this mansion, I asked the old lady to draw them up. It's true that I was climbing the social ladder by coming here with grandfather's marriage contract. I was desperate and had nowhere else to turn." I paused, then continued quietly. "But it's also true that I ruined your chance to marry Miss Chu. I used a debt of gratitude to force you into this marriage. I have lived with that guilt every single day. Grandfather's marriage contract is the only truth that matters," Xieshu said, his jaw tightening. "Miss Chu and I had only a verbal agreement. How could you have ruined something that was never official?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice firm. "Your father saving my grandfather's life was a great kindness. I agreed to this marriage of my own free will. No one forced me. Why do you carry this guilt?" I looked up at him in shock. "Then why did you ask to be posted away from the capital right after we married?" A belated wave of grievance crashed over me, almost drowning me. I blinked, and my vision blurred with tears. "If you agreed to this marriage voluntarily, then why have you been so cold to me all these years? Why have you held such deep prejudices against me?" "But," I choked out, my voice barely a whisper, "I'm so tired." Xieshu froze, staring at me in stunned silence. Tears brimmed in my eyes. For the first time, I called him by his courtesy name, repeating the words, "Cheng Jun, I'm so tired." "Running a household is indeed a heavy burden," Xieshu said, looking flustered for the first time. He handed me a silk handkerchief, his voice softening. "My mother is useless when it comes to such matters. You have worked very hard. Tomorrow, I will tell Mo Yun to find you some experienced matrons to help ease your load." The tears finally spilled over. A familiar sense of helplessness settled heavily in my chest, dragging me down. "Is this still about that bolt of Shu brocade?" Xieshu asked in a hurry. "I will write to my friend in Shu Prefecture at once. In less than half a month, he will send you the finest brocade in the province." I sank deeper into the vortex of helplessness. "No," I said, shaking my head, letting the tears stream down my face without bothering to wipe them away. "Husband, now that you've returned to the capital, your official career is flourishing," I said, taking a deep breath and bowing to him, my tone gentle but resolute. "You deserve a marriage that can support you in your ambitions. If you refuse to agree to the divorce, I will request to leave this mansion of my own accord." The candle flame flickered. The room was so quiet that our breathing was the only sound. Xieshu stared at me for a long time, then stood up abruptly and stormed out of the room, his sleeves flaring angrily behind him. As soon as the words left my mouth, the heavy stone that had been weighing on my chest for years felt lighter, almost as if it had been lifted away entirely. I summoned all the servants who attended to the main courtyard and announced my decision to them in a calm, steady voice. They looked at me in stunned confusion and fear. Qingzhu burst into tears, her shoulders shaking with sobs. The moonlight tonight was beautiful, clear, bright, and cold. I stared up at the moon, feeling no desire to comfort anyone. It was only then that I realized, after living in this Earl's mansion for 4 years, this was the first time I had truly smelled the faint, sweet fragrance of pear blossoms in the air. Half an hour later, the old lady sent for me to come to her courtyard. Xieshu stood tall and straight by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his face turned away from me. As soon as Cheng Jun mentioned it, I remembered, the old lady said, pressing a hand to her chest. I did sign those divorce papers for you, didn't I? I'll admit, I didn't like you very much back then. But these past few years, even though you've never been one to boast, you've handled everything with dedication and care. Why do you want a divorce? The old lady slammed her hand down on the table, her voice rising in anger. My son is back now. What on earth do you have to be dissatisfied with? I looked over at the window, where Xieshu remained as unreadable as ever. I sighed softly. It's not that I'm dissatisfied with anything. Husband is a man of exceptional talent and noble bearing. I was always out of my league. The old lady's expression softened slightly. If you know you were out of your league, then leaving according to our original agreement is for the best, I said. Now that husband is back in the capital, his official career is sure to reach even greater heights. He is young and promising. Why shouldn't he marry someone who can truly support him? The old lady's face relaxed further. Besides, everyone in the capital is waiting for the young master of the Xie family to marry a noble lady, a well-educated woman from a prominent family. Someone who would be 100 times better than me at managing a household. I smiled faintly. You wouldn't have to worry about these things anymore. You could go back to living the carefree life you used to have. The old lady's anger had faded completely, but she still looked hesitant. She was about to speak when Xieshu cut in, his voice cold and sharp. Mother, please give us a moment alone. The old lady left the room. Xieshu turned to face me, sitting down across the table. His expression was calm, but an aura of quiet authority emanated from him, pressing down on me like a weight. How do you plan to support yourself after the divorce? In this day and age, women relied on their fathers before marriage and their husbands after. Even though this dynasty was considered more open and tolerant than most, it was still rare for a woman to seek a divorce. When the old lady signed the divorce papers 4 years ago, she already promised to help me establish my own household as an independent woman. I said, meeting his gaze openly and without hesitation, I do not need any compensation or money from you. Over the past few years, my paintings have gained a small measure of fame. Shishan Pavilion, the one run by Princess Rui in secret, has been auctioning most of my works. Xieshu looked up at me sharply, his hands clenched into fists on the table, his knuckles white. My grandmother is old, but her health is still good, I said, my voice softening. She has a small cottage on the outskirts of the city. Her time is limited. I want to spend it with her. I was remiss, Xieshu said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I should have brought her to live in the mansion a long time ago. Grandmother has lived in the countryside all her life, I replied gently. She would never agree to come here. You've thought of everything, haven't you? Xieshu said, his eyes fixed on mine. His voice steady as he asked each word slowly. You've wanted a divorce from the very beginning, haven't you? I smiled and said simply, yes. On the day I left the Earl's mansion, every pear tree in the courtyard was in full bloom, their blossoms covering the ground like a blanket of white snow. There were countless household affairs to settle. Xieshu and I sat side by side on the main seats in the flower hall, with all the stewards from inside and outside the mansion standing below us. Since I was leaving, I had to hand over all my responsibilities properly. The old lady was incapable of managing the household, so Xieshu would have to learn the ropes. I had spent 4 years in this mansion, establishing rules and regulations for every aspect of its operation. In less than half an hour, I had sorted out all the accounts and procedures, explaining everything clearly and concisely. Xieshu had started the meeting sipping tea, looking relaxed and unconcerned. By the end, he was left speechless. He set down his teacup after a long while, his voice low and filled with emotion. You have handled everything with remarkable thoroughness, madam. He paused, his voice thickening with regret. You have worked so hard these past few years. After I leave, You can continue to follow the rules and regulations I have put in place, I said, ignoring his words. I spread out the stack of ledgers that Uncle Chen had handed me. Most importantly, these are the general ledgers for the past 4 years. 3 months after our wedding, when Xieshu had left for Shu Prefecture, I had struggled to manage the mansion alone. The servants had been quick to take advantage of my inexperience. That first year, I had suffered countless losses in the accounts. But after enduring so many silent grievances, after spending so many late nights poring over ledgers by lamplight until my head spun, I had finally mastered the art of managing a household. Every entry, every expense was clear and transparent. After reviewing the first 3 thick ledgers, Uncle Chen sighed deeply, his voice filled with admiration. Madam has always conducted herself with the utmost integrity. Not a single mistake has been made in these past 3 years. Xieshu's hand trembled slightly as he held his teacup. I reached for the 4th ledger, ready to open it, but Xieshu suddenly reached out and grabbed my wrist. His touch was gentle. As if he were afraid of startling me. There's no need to check any further, he said, his voice hoarse. He repeated the words, softer this time. No need. Yes, there is, I said, looking into his eyes, my voice trembling with a barely suppressed emotion. You need to see for yourself whether I am truly the vain, flawed woman you thought I was. Xieshu released my wrist as if he had been burned. For the first time in our marriage, when our eyes met, he was the one who looked away first. Silence filled the flower hall. I looked out at the crowd of stewards standing below us, then smiled faintly and said, "Thank you all for your care and assistance these past 4 years." Uncle Chen abruptly turned his face away, his shoulders shaking. The others either reddened their eyes or hung their heads in silence. A sense of reluctant farewell hung thick in the air. I turned to Xieshu, pouring him a cup of tea with both hands, offering it to him as a toast in lieu of wine. "You have been kind and generous, young master. Thank you for all you have done to help my brother return home. I will never forget your kindness." Xieshu's lips moved, as if he wanted to say something. Finally, he whispered, "It was the least I could do." I smiled and stood up, bowing to him respectfully. "I would be grateful if you would take these divorce papers to the government office to have them officially sealed with a red stamp." Before Xieshu could reply, I turned and walked out of the flower hall. I passed through the flower hall, walked across the central courtyard, my footsteps light. The century-old pear tree showered me with falling blossoms, as if reluctant to let me go, or perhaps offering me a gentle, blessing-filled farewell. A hired carriage was waiting for me at the side gate. I lifted the hem of my skirt and was about to step up the last step when I heard a young voice calling out behind me, "Madam." I turned around. The corridors lining both sides of the gate were crowded with the mansion's servants, all staring at me with expressions of reluctant longing. At the far end of the corridor, standing in front of the main hall, were the old lady and Xieshu. In front of me, a young boy of about 10 years old dropped to his knees with a loud thud, kowtowing to me 3 times, his forehead hitting the ground firmly. I was taken aback, reaching out to help him up, but the boy looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears, and said, 2 years ago, my mother was gravely ill, and we had no money to buy medicine. It was you, Madam, you told Miss Qingzhu to secretly send us silver." I froze, the memory flooding back to me at last. "Madam saved my mother's life. Most people in this mansion have received your kindness. We all know how compassionate you are to us," he said, sniffling. "I can't read or write, so I don't know how to put it into fancy words. I just hope you have a smooth and happy life from now on." I helped him to his feet. Uncle Chen had taken him in as his godson half a year ago. Even if he was being reckless today, the old lady would not punish him severely for Uncle Chen's sake. That was why he dared to kowtow to me on behalf of everyone in the mansion today. "Ask Uncle Chen to teach you how to read and write in the future." My eyes felt a little moist. I blinked back the tears and forced my voice out. I understand your feelings. From now on, please take good care of Qingzhu for me. I looked up and saw Qingzhu hiding behind a pillar in the corridor on the right, her eyes red from crying. She was a silly girl, unfortunately. Her indenture contract belonged to the Earl's mansion. I couldn't take her with me when I left. I finally turned my gaze to the main hall in the distance. It was too far to see the expression on Xieshu's face clearly, but it didn't matter anymore. During these 4 years in the Earl's mansion, when had I ever truly seen his face clearly? I got into the carriage, the wheels rolled forward. I sat there for a long while before it finally sank in. I had walked out of the Earl's mansion. I lifted the curtain and watched as we passed through the busy, bustling streets of the city. The crowds thinned out gradually, replaced by the clear, crisp chirping of birds. On the country path ahead, the familiar expanse of farmland came into view. After about the time it takes to burn an incense stick, the carriage stopped, revealing a small courtyard at the end of the road, simple and rustic. Its wooden door half open, chickens and ducks pecking at grain, a scene of perfect peace and leisure. As I drew closer, I saw an old woman standing by the roadside, smiling warmly at me. Grandmother. I jumped down from the carriage and ran toward her, throwing myself into her arms just like I did when I was a little girl. In the distance, through the dense forest, a bird flitted past the treetops, its wings beating as it vanished into the sea of leaves. The tired bird had finally returned to its nest. The small courtyard was simple and unadorned, with green moss clinging stubbornly to the stone steps, nothing like the magnificent Earl's mansion with its blue tiles and red eaves. But it had a bright, spacious study that took up most of the main hall. A large red sandalwood desk sat horizontally in the center, flanked by bamboo bookshelves. A few bunches of wild flowers were tucked into clay jars on the desk, adding a touch of rustic charm. I asked the carpenter at the village entrance to make this big desk, Grandmother said, not asking a single question about why I had come back. She walked over and propped open the window. He's a skilled craftsman. It took him over half a year to finish it. Outside the window, the courtyard was filled with pear trees. Unlike the century-old, gnarled pear tree in the Earl's mansion, these were only 3 or 4 years old, but they were already covered in blossoms as white as snow. The year you married into the Earl's mansion, I had just recovered from my illness and was able to walk again, Grandmother said, smiling at me. So I planted this whole grove of pear trees. Now, at long last, the pear trees have waited for their pear blossom girl to come home. A sharp ache pricked my nose, and tears spilled down my cheeks. I stepped forward and hugged her tightly. Grandmother, that night, cicadas chirped everywhere, fireflies flitted about like scattered stars, and the moon and stars cast their bright glow over the courtyard. Grandmother and I ate dinner outside. The meal was simple, plain tea and simple food, but it tasted more delicious than any feast I had ever had in the mansion. I sipped the fish soup and said, tomorrow I'll go net some fish by the stream. Fish are at their most delicious this time of year. Grandmother laughed and asked, do you still remember how to catch fish? Of course I do. I blinked and said in a soft, coquettish tone, tomorrow I'll show you what your granddaughter is capable of. Life in the countryside was simple and lacking in many comforts, but it made me feel relaxed and free. No more morning and evening greetings to perform. Sometimes I slept until the sun was high in the sky. Sometimes I stayed up late into the night painting. Occasionally, when I thought back to life in the Earl's mansion, it felt unreal, like a distant dream. I had plenty of time to paint, and I also started reading books. I painted scenes of the stream, the mountains, the lakes, and the countryside. My paintings were no longer limited to just that single pear tree. One bright, clear day, I was walking back to the courtyard from the lake with my easel on my back, carrying a few crabs in my hand, wondering whether to steam or stir-fry them. When I reached the gate, I saw a luxurious carriage parked there. I stopped in my tracks. Qingzhu seemed to sense my presence and looked up. her face lighting up with surprise. Madam, in the distance, Xieshu stood tall and straight, dressed in a pale blue robe embroidered with floating clouds and wild cranes, a silver belt cinching his waist. He looked as elegant and composed as ever. The man looked at me with a gentle gaze, a hint of anticipation in his eyes. The smile faded from my face. I greeted him politely and distantly. Master Xie. The anticipation in his eyes dimmed instantly. Xieshu bowed respectfully to my grandmother. His voice filled with deep remorse as he said that it had been his dereliction of duty not to have brought her to live in the Earl's mansion. Grandmother's attitude was calm, neither overly warm nor cold. She smiled and returned his bow. This is wild tea picked from the mountains. I received Xieshu in the courtyard, handing him a teacup. Please forgive the simplicity, Master Xie. Xieshu took the teacup calmly, took a sip, and said, "It has a unique flavor of its own." I did not respond. "You look," his gaze fell on my face, and he paused for a moment before continuing softly, "You look much healthier than when you were in the mansion." I suddenly burst out laughing, so hard that I almost dropped my teacup. Xieshu stared at me in stunned silence, as if he were seeing me for the first time. For over half a month, I had been wandering the mountains and fields, often carrying my easel out to find inspiration. My skin had tanned a little from the sun. It was quite kind of him to put it so tactfully. He set down his teacup, looking a little flustered, as if remembering something. He turned and told Qingzhu to bring over a brocade box. "This is Shu brocade from Shu Prefecture." Xieshu opened the box himself, his voice warm and gentle. "It's this year's new collection from Yunshou Pavilion. I wonder if you like it." I glanced at it, then said directly, "I never cared about that missing bolt of Shu brocade." Xieshu clenched his hand slightly, his eyes fixed on the brocade box, avoiding my gaze. The reason I was wearing that old robe that day was simply because I didn't like the new clothes tailored for me according to the mansion's regulations. I smiled faintly. I've never been fond of clothes with overly bright colors. I actually guessed as much. Xieshu closed the brocade box and said suddenly, "The flower viewing banquet held at the mansion a few days ago, all the guests said it wasn't nearly as well organized as the ones you used to host. Mother misses you very much." Xieshu took a deep breath and looked up, meeting my eyes. "The stewards all say that the household affairs haven't been running as smoothly since you left." I took a sip of tea, then changed the subject. 3 months after our wedding, you requested to be posted away from the capital. That was the first time I ever organized the flower viewing banquet for the mansion. That banquet was a complete disaster. I laughed. I made so many mistakes. I couldn't tell the difference between the relatives and guests, and I had no idea which of the ladies' husbands were your close friends. I came from a humble background, and no one had ever taught me the rules of noble etiquette. I looked at him and said softly, "My husband had left me, and my mother-in-law knew nothing about managing a household. I was completely alone, with no one to turn to for help." Xieshu's eyelashes trembled. He turned his face away, his breathing growing heavier. "Master Xie, you have no idea how the servants in the mansion disobeyed me behind my back that first year. Just because I was a neglected young mistress." I sighed. "I wasn't born with the ability to manage a household so well. I learned it the hard way." The atmosphere fell into an awkward silence. Only the faint chirping of birds could be heard in the distance. "We have already signed the divorce papers. I hope you will send them to the government office to be officially sealed as soon as possible." I stood up and said, "Master Xie, I won't see you out." After seeing Xieshu off, I thought my life would return to its peaceful routine. But from then on, every time he had a day off, he would come to visit me. He always brought gifts, but not gold, silver, or silk. Instead, he brought things like firewood, rice, oil, salt, poetry collections, and painting albums. Even when I refused to accept them, he knew how to act with perfect propriety. After all, He had passed the imperial examinations at a young age and served as an official in the provinces for 3 years. He was well versed in the ways of the world. It all depended on whether he was willing to make the effort. The cold indifference he had shown me in the past was simply because I had not been worth his time. But putting aside our past grievances, Xie, when he set aside his pride, was indeed a knowledgeable and talented man, a good teacher and a helpful friend. He had studied hard for the imperial examinations and had years of life experience under his belt. Our conversations always gave me new insights and inspiration. On a warm spring afternoon, he came to visit on his day off. He met me by the stream where I was painting, and helped me carry my easel back to the courtyard. Grandmother brewed tea with mountain spring water, its fragrance refreshing and invigorating. As he sipped the tea, he suddenly said, "Li Niang, can you give me another chance? Will you come back to the mansion with me?" I did not answer immediately. I finished the tea in my bowl calmly before saying, "Master Xie, please come with me." I led Xie into the inner courtyard and pushed open the door to my study. The pear blossoms outside the window had passed their peak bloom. Petals as white as snow fell all over the ground, and some had drifted into my study as well. The study was filled with my paintings, the rich scent of ink filling the air. "Master Xie." If I had stayed in the Earl's mansion, I looked at him and said, I would never have had a study like this. A look of remorse flashed across Xieshu's face. He was about to speak, but I cut him off, and I would never have had the leisure time to paint like this. He fell silent abruptly. "During the years I was married to you, there were times when I really felt wronged." I stared at my paintings and said softly, "But it was only natural for you to resent me. In the end, it was all my fault for forcing you into this marriage." "No, it was my fault." Xieshu stood by the door, laughing bitterly at himself. "I was young and arrogant. And I hurt you deeply. For all the years I spent studying the teachings of the sages, I acted like a complete fool." I laughed too, reaching out to touch one of my paintings. Our wedding night was so painful, it left me with a terrible fear of intimacy. Xieshu's face turned bright red in an instant, the blush spreading down his neck. He was so ashamed that he could not speak a word. "I'm sorry for being so blunt." I raised an eyebrow and looked at him. "But when you came back from your posting, that night, you were very gentle." I remember many moments of humiliation and grievance. I remember summoning up all my courage to ask if I could go with you when you left for Shu Prefecture. I said, my voice soft. His reply had been a cold, sharp rebuke, merciless, every word cutting like a knife. But all of that is in the past now. I looked at Xieshu's face, filled with regret and pain. Since the divorce, I have barely thought about those unhappy times. I don't want to go back to the Earl's mansion because being a noble lady is not the life I want. I'm a lazy person at heart, born and raised in the countryside. I'm used to being free and unrestrained. Those 4 years in the mansion, with the endless rounds of morning and evening greetings, and the overwhelming responsibility of managing the household almost suffocated me. "Master Xie," I pointed to the paintings that filled the room and smiled. "Look. My paintings are no longer just about pear trees now." It was the first time that Xieshu had rushed back to the city before the city gates closed on his day off. He left in such a hurry that he almost looked like he was fleeing. My life returned to its peaceful rhythm once more. I drank wine, brewed tea, read poetry, and painted. Occasionally, I entertained a few other women whose paintings were also auctioned at Shishan Pavilion. Qingzhu came to visit me every 10 days, bringing me news from the Earl's mansion. For example, she told me that the account books had become a mess since I left, and that Xieshu had suddenly moved his living quarters to the cold lotus garden in the back courtyard, and had renovated a large study there, with doors connecting the east, west, inner, and outer rooms. She also told me that the old lady had recently been arranging matchmaking meetings for Xieshu with noble young ladies in the capital, but he had turned them all down. I listened and promptly forgot about it. Life in the mountains was filled with new and interesting things every day. Looking out the window at the vast, endless landscape, I found that many things no longer had a place in my heart. By the time all the pear blossoms had fallen and small fruits began to appear on the trees, Xieshu came to visit my mountain courtyard again. It was early summer, and a fine drizzle had been falling continuously for days. The distant peaks were shrouded in mist. Like a misty ink-wash painting, Xieshu knocked on my courtyard door, wearing a straw raincoat and a bamboo hat. I opened the door holding an oil paper umbrella, surprised to see him braving the rain to come here. He smiled gently at me, then stepped aside to reveal the person he had been shielding behind him. A boy of 17 or 18 stood there, his skin tanned dark, half of his ear had been cut off, and his face was covered in hideous scars, marked with the brand of a criminal tattoo. Tears streamed from the boy's good eye. He grinned at me, showing his teeth. "Sister." The umbrella slipped from my hand and fell to the ground. I threw myself into the boy's arms, sobbing bitterly, my whole body trembling so violently that I could barely speak. Grandmother heard my cries and hurried out, alarmed. When she saw the scene, she froze in place. Brother Heng patted my back gently, then walked over to the steps where grandmother
the old physician his fee. I turned to look at Xieshu, forcing a bitter smile. "I'm sorry to trouble you again. You know I hate it when you insist on drawing such a clear line between us." Xieshu looked at me for a long time, as if he wanted to say something. But in the end, he swallowed his words. After that, Xieshu came to visit every 3 days. His attitude had returned to the polite, distant formality of our first meeting, but somehow, it was warmer than before. I refused him many times, sometimes firmly, sometimes gently, but he always brushed off my refusals with his usual calm composure. On the day of the last summer rain, the pear trees outside the window were heavy with fruit. Grandmother, who had been bedridden for a long time, suddenly got up. She looked surprisingly energetic. She sat down on the steps, then waved at Xieshu, who was standing in the courtyard, her voice filled with kindness. "Young man from the Xie family, come here." Xieshu walked over quickly, squatting down beside her. "You really are a handsome young man," grandmother said, touching his face with her gnarled hand and smiling. "You would make a good husband." 4 years ago, her father died wrongfully in prison. Brother Heng's fate was unknown. I was lying on my deathbed. The doctor said that to save my life, I would need an old ginseng root, grandmother said, her voice slow and lingering. A single root cost 1,000 taels of silver. It might as well have been asking for my life. My granddaughter cried by my bed, begging me to hold on a little longer for her. My poor Li Niang had nowhere else to turn. That was why she went to the Earl's mansion and begged for help. Brother Heng and I felt our eyes grow hot with tears. We turned our faces away. Xieshu seemed to sense what she was about to say. He shook his head hastily. Grandmother smiled. "Taking advantage of a debt of gratitude to force a marriage, it was wrong of us. I have always felt deeply guilty about it. There were times when I wanted to just let go and die, but I couldn't bear to leave my granddaughter behind. She had already suffered so much. I promised her I would stay with her. But in the Earl's mansion, she was alone and helpless. We had done something wrong. How could we ever have the courage to go to the mansion and be with her? No, it's not like that," Xieshu said, his voice strained. "It was my fault as your grandson-in-law. I should have brought you to live in the mansion a long time ago. I do not blame you, young Master Xie," grandmother said gently. "The Earl of Jinning's mansion has always been kind and benevolent, and you are a man of honor. But life is full of such twists and turns. That ginseng root extended my life by 4 years, but it also separated my Li Niang and me for 4 long years before we could be reunited." Her voice was soft and wise. "Your marriage was the same. Things did not turn out as either of you wished. You were husband and wife, but unfortunately, your feelings were shallow and your fate was thin. You had the chance to be together, but not the destiny to stay together." Grandmother patted his head, her tone gentle and final. "Life is long and full of endless possibilities. Let each other go." Xieshu lowered his head, his shoulders trembled, and silent tears fell to the ground. A wind began to blow. Grandmother looked out at the pear trees filling the courtyard. smiling faintly. What a pity. I won't get to taste this year's pears. The last time I saw Xieshu was in early autumn, when the pears were ripe. Brother Heng and I had just finished arranging grandmother's funeral. Our carriage reached a roadside pavilion outside the city gates. Brother Heng, who was driving, pulled on the reins and said, "Sister, Master Xie is in the pavilion ahead." I lifted the curtain and climbed down from the carriage. Inside the pavilion, Xieshu stood with his hands behind his back, dressed in an elegant blue brocade robe with a silver belt around his waist. The robe was embroidered with a subtle pattern of floating clouds and wild cranes, a perfect gentleman. As noble and pure as jade, the pattern of floating clouds and wild cranes on his robe had been stitched by my own hands. Steam curled up from the hot tea on the table. We sat down facing each other. Xieshu poured me a cup of tea, smiling as he asked, "Where are you off to this time?" I lowered my head and sipped the tea, its orchid fragrance filling my nose. Shu Prefecture. A moment of silence fell between us. After a long while, Xieshu said softly, "Shu Prefecture, a land of fertile fields stretching for miles. A land of abundance. It is a good place." I smiled at him. "Li Niang," Xieshu said, lowering his head, his voice deep and slow. "There are nights when I wake up suddenly. My heart filled with regret and pain. I can't help but think, if only I had been gentler to you on our wedding night. If only I had taken you with me when you begged to come with me to Shu Prefecture." Xieshu laughed bitterly at himself. "You are so intelligent and talented. If only I had put aside my prejudices back then, would things have turned out differently today? Everything is in the past now." I smiled. "The Earl's mansion is a wonderful place, and you are a good man. But you and I are simply not meant for each other." "Yes," Xieshu said, smiling faintly, "a bird will always yearn to fly high into the sky." He stood up, raising his teacup in a toast, his voice warm and sincere. "The road ahead is 1,000 miles long. Take good care of yourself." I clinked my teacup against his. "Though we may be separated by the ends of the earth, we will always be close in heart. I wish you well too." The carriage rolled forward again. I took one last look out the window. Xieshu's figure grew smaller and smaller until the city gates disappeared from my sight. I looked up at the sky, clear and bright, with a cool autumn breeze blowing gently. The swallows and sparrows had already flown south for the winter. Epilogue. Host. Hello everyone, and welcome to our program Painting Through 1,000 Years. Today, we are honored to have Professor Yu from Yangjing University with us, as we once again delve into the artistic world of Shunli. Professor Yu, we're old friends, no need for formal introductions. Host. Professor Yu, I've heard that the newly unearthed painting A Snowdrift has been confirmed to be an authentic work by Shunli. Professor Yu. Through the collaborative efforts of experts from multiple disciplines and comprehensive research based on various forms of evidence, this painting of pear blossoms, though unsigned and without a seal, has been verified as an authentic early work by Shunli, based on its brushwork, composition, and use of color. Host. This discovery has caused quite a stir online. Not only is Shunli an extremely popular figure in the art world today, but this painting A Snowdrift was unearthed from the tomb of Xie Chengjun, a famous minister from the early years of the Huan dynasty. Both official historical records and unofficial historical research confirm that Xie Chengjun and Shunli were once married. Professor Yu, it must be said that this painting is exceptionally well preserved. It is clear that its owner cherished it dearly during his lifetime. Host. Xie Chengjun's life was filled with ups and downs. He rose to the position of Grand Secretary, the highest-ranking official in the empire, yet his marital life was marked by hardship. After his divorce from Shunli, it is said that he never remarried for the rest of his life. Professor, official historical records have very little to say about his marital status, but one thing is certain, he indeed had no biological children of his own. In his later years, he adopted a child from a collateral branch of the family. Host. The love and hatred between this couple have been talked about with great relish to this day. Many people also feel a sense of regret, thinking that if their marriage could have lasted, it would have been a perfect tale of marital harmony. Professor, if that were the case, Shunli would never have achieved such widespread acclaim. Her lofty status in the art world today stems not only from the elegant charm and transcendent artistic conception of her brushwork, but also from the fact that she traveled extensively across the land in her lifetime. She captured the winding mountain valleys and the swirling clouds and flowing waters in her paintings, pioneering the genre of inkwash pastoral landscape painting. As a woman, she filled a gap in history from another perspective, presenting an image of a female artist who was both refined and carefree, open-minded and composed. In her later years, Li converted to Buddhism, and her paintings were imbued with a sense of Zen philosophy. She comprehended the mysteries of nature and attained a harmony with the divine will. Her works transcended the boundaries of reality. Countless literati, poets, and women confined to their boudoirs in later generations sought their ideal realm in her paintings. Everyone adored Li not only for her art, but also for her extraordinary personal charm. Host, that's true. If she had stayed with Xie Chengjun for a lifetime, she would have been nothing more than an unnamed Grand Secretary's wife in the annals of history, and the world would have never known the great artist Li. However, there's also a view in the art world that compared to depicting landscapes, ms, Li actually loved painting pear trees more, though such works appeared less frequently in her later years. Can this newly unearthed painting verify this claim? Professor, it is true that Li loved painting pear trees. Such works mostly date back to the early years of her marriage, when her painting skills were still relatively immature and her works were filled with sorrow and resentment. Yet even then, her use of color was fresh and delicate, and her artistic conception already contained the essence that would characterize her later masterpieces. We speculate that at that time, confined to the inner quarters of a noble mansion, her thinking and vision were somewhat limited. Even in her later years, Li still loved painting pear trees, but such works were overshadowed by her numerous landscape and pastoral paintings. In her old age, her niece compiled all her pear tree paintings into an album, which Li personally inscribed. Li led a rich and extraordinary life. She lived to the ripe old age of 80 in that era. Legend has it that her last painting was also of pear trees. When her niece found her, her body was covered with snow-white pear blossoms. She had passed away peacefully under a pear tree, still holding her paintbrush in her hand. Host, what inscription did Li write for that compiled album of paintings? Professor smiled and replied, gazing at the pear tree by the east fence, I feel a twinge of melancholy. How many clear and bright days can one truly see in a lifetime? The album was titled A Snowdrift.